Thanks for joining us today for Think Big with Michael Zellner, sponsored by Sleepy Z's Masonry. Joining me today for episode 175, part one of my interview series with him, is Richie McGinniss. Richie's journey into the national and international spotlight began pretty much mostly on August 25th, 2020, when, as a chief video editor, director for the Daily Caller, a conservative website that was founded by Tucker Carlson, he found himself in the middle of the craziness and chaos that night in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Just minutes before the shooting began that night, he was interviewing Kyle Rittenhouse in front of a gas station. A little while after that, Richie's life changed forever, and he is here today to tell us about his experience that night and also his involvement in the riots and after the death of George Floyd, with the Proud Boys in Chicago and Seattle's Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, and a face-off between the Umbrella Gang and the NYPD in New York City protest in front of the City Hall. And also, he was also in Portland when they had a clash between demonstrators and federal officers too. He also has worked with the very well-known Mark Levin, who has a show on Fox every weekend called Life, Liberty, and Levin. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about today with the audience is talked about in his new and upcoming book called Riot Diet, One Man's Radical Ride Through, and he has it right there behind him, Through America in Chaos, that's going to be coming out very shortly. Great to have you on today, Richie.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. So first of all, I have to ask you, how did you end up being in the wrong place? I guess you could say at the right time in Kenosha, Wisconsin, smack dab in the middle of what would end up making, national, international news and talked about on every regular cable and news network here in the United States. How did that happen?
Well, I guess it depends on how far we go back, but basically I moved to DC in 2008, and just before we went on air, we were talking about, the Obama years and how you went from voting for Obama to voting for Trump. And during that time period, I moved to DC in '08. I was knocking on doors for Obama and studying Arabic at Georgetown. And in the process of studying Arabic, living over in that region, I basically decided I didn't agree with anything our government did over there. And I got into media. So I interned at Al Jazeera Arabic. Then I went to MSNBC at NBC as a production assistant. And actually, after that, I was doing freelance video in DC, and I actually got a job offer to be a video editor for this guy, Mark Levin. And during the interview, the guys, they revealed to me this big name, Mark Levin, who is doing this online show. And I almost had to feign surprise. Like, I knew the name, but I went home and Googled it and realized that Mark Levin was the second biggest radio personality behind in America. And I thought to myself, how sheltered have I been, growing up on the East Coast in the New York area and then going to school in DC, and I didn't even know who this guy was. So I worked for Mark Levin during Trump's campaign, and I signed on to the Daily Caller at the very beginning of the Trump years to start a video outlet there, and that was May of 2017. And so over the course of that time period, basically built a little mini video outlet within that front page website. And, we were covering a lot of on the ground stuff. And when the pandemic hit, for our team, which is a bunch of young kids doing on the ground reporting, it was devastating because nobody wants to watch a 25-year-old kid do a Zoom meeting with some doctor from their, shoddy apartment in Washington, D.C.
Right.
And so it was really a major business crisis for us. And I discussed that in the book where, the revenue just fell out the window when the pandemic hit. And after the Memorial Day riots in D.C., after the death of George Floyd, there were a couple other folks who worked at the Caller as reporters, Jorge Ventura and Shelby Talcott, who were kind of along, actually probably more looking after me over the course of this journey, even though it was supposed to be vice versa. And we were like, okay, well, all these corporate media outlets, they're all sitting on the outside of these protest zones saying, well, yes, it's fiery, but mostly peaceful in here.
Right.
Classic line. And we just decided to go on a mission with our cell phones sitting in the middle of these power vacuums, I would call them, in Seattle and Portland and in DC, in New York, and then finally ending up in Kenosha. And my interaction with Kyle Rittenhouse was basically the same thing that I had been doing all along, which is show up in these places, who are the protesters, who are the counter protesters, and just let them tell their own versions of why they think they're there, what they think, they're doing, what their good intentions are, and then really just prodding with my questions of, okay, so you think you're here for this reason, and but what about this and this and that?
Right.
So you can see that in my interview with Kyle Rittenhouse, where basically, he told me, "Oh, I'm out here with my rifle to defend myself, and then I have my EMT bag to help protesters with medical problems." And I asked him multiple times about, well, you sure you're an EMT? Like you're EMT certified? So basically, Kyle had this idea that he was out there to help people with both defending the business that he was standing in front of when I interviewed him, and also providing medical attention. Now, once we started walking out and he started, I guess, administering medical assistance to these protesters, he was shouting, "Medical, medical, anyone need medical?" And these protesters slash rioters saw him walking around with that rifle and viewed him very differently than he viewed, his own role in that space. And so I think that's the story of all these other places we witnessed in the Chaz. We witnessed a bunch of folks going there. You mentioned the Proud Boys, these activists, I call them flagversaries, they decided to go into the Chaz with American flags. And the mere fact that that American flag was seen as so polarizing that they brought the Proud Boys in to provide them with security, I think says a lot about where America was then and where we are today, which is like the American flag has become this polarizing symbol.
Right.
But basically, over the course of that whole summer, and then even into the MAGA demonstrations, the Stop the Steals, and January 6th, the mission remained the same, which is, all these corporate entities are sitting outside the protest zone with their big cameras and, pontificating from their studios. And we're just going to go inside, record raw video, relay that to the audience, and let them decide for themselves without commentary.
One thing that we talked about before we got on air was you'd mentioned the word uniparty. And I've said that for probably the last few years that I think, DC has become, pretty much one big uniparty, the Democrats, Republicans, and whoever. And why do you think it's become that way?
Well, that's a great question, and there's definitely a lot to unpack. But from my perspective, working at NBC during the Obama years, I think that's the perfect example of how, we got to 2016 in the first place. Because you have the White House briefing room, right? And the White House briefing room, it used to be the swimming pool where FDR, rehabilitated his legs, and where Kennedy famously, allegedly, had some fun with some interns. They covered up that pool and turned it into this briefing room. It's this little room. And during the Clinton administration, they started this White House daily briefing. They abbreviate it in DC, everything has an acronym. So at NBC, it was the WHBR. But that's this daily briefing where all the reporters gather in there from the White House press corps, from all the major press outlets, and they had the opportunity to ask the White House press secretary questions. Now, if you want to get a question inside of that briefing room and you want your career, you want to move up the ladder, you need to ask the right questions. And if you ask the wrong questions, say, something about big pharma or something about how our foreign wars aren't going the way that we want to, if it steps over that line, then you're never going to get a question again. And so I think really like the reason why I got into media in the first place, from my perspective, a lot of why this uniparty was able to atrophy and develop and entrench itself so deeply in Washington, D.C., was because the fourth estate, the press, weren't serving their responsibility of keeping the government in check. And so there were no tough questions about, well, what is the difference between Bill Clinton's administration and George Bush one's administration? No questions of, well, how is this laissez-faire economic policies? How are those affecting American citizens? And I think, the Iraq War is the most perfect example of that. You had this WMD narrative that the American intelligence agency came out with, which justified our invasion of Iraq. And you had the press, who's both on the left and the right, their sole responsibility, they were the linchpin right there to question that narrative and to question the government, rather than just taking, what they said about this WMD narrative, hook, line, and sinker. It's like, we're not just, the press's role isn't just to take intel reports and aggregate them to the public. And
Right.
so when they had that opportunity to ask those tough questions. I don't know if you recall, I was in sixth grade, but I remember my dad switching through the channels and just saying, "Hey, you see CNN and MSNBC? They're just as for the war as Fox News." There was this whole support the troops, politically correct, don't be politically incorrect, and question, why we're going in there. And I think that's why you had such widespread national support, was because all of the press was for it. And that really comes back to this kind of like media industrial complex that was formed around Washington, D.C.
And you're younger, but a lot of people forget that Clinton was able to work with Newt Gingrich, who was the Speaker of the House at the time. I believe they had a balanced budget like 4 or 5 years in a row. So things were different back then, and I think a big part of the change, in my opinion, has been social media, where good as great as the internet is. I always tell people there's just as many positives as there are negatives.
Mhm.
But one of the things is now regular people, like us to start with, have a voice and can go online and hide behind a computer and
Mhm.
display it. And it's made our country more polarized, because now, I mean, gosh, now even just in the last week since Trump won the election, there's videos on there of people disowning their family and friends and all these kind of things. I'm like thinking, oh my gosh, you're doing this over two men you've never met before in your life.
Exactly. And that's a lot of what's in the book. I originally talking to publishers in 2022, they were telling me that Trump wasn't going to run again. It's old news. And, I saw the writing on the wall. I'd already seen, I knew that he was going to win back in 2015, just based upon like the fact that the moment that Bernie got kicked out of the race, I guess that was in 2016, the moment that and I say kicked out because
Yeah.
it wasn't the kind of primary process, the democratic process that you would expect from quote unquote republic, democratic republic. And so once I saw that happen, I knew Trump was going to win then. And I was at January 6th. I witnessed that. I followed the rioters all the way to the House doors. And everybody said, oh, January 6th has destroyed him. There's no way he's coming back from that. But I really knew, I saw the dedication of not only his core supporters, but also like what the zeitgeist that he was able to capture, as far as what you were talking about with the Uniparty and the average American, and the way that he navigates through this polarized landscape is like, they don't call him Teflon Don for nothing.
Right.
And so in this kind of digital battlefield that we have now, where everybody has to pick a side, that suits his style, his approach very well. And that if you compare him to like a guy like Ron DeSantis, I mean, there was just, in my eyes, there was no way that that was going to happen. So, um, I think over the Biden administration, we saw that polarization only increase, and especially once Trump announced and came back in and started his race, it's really like you said, there's the good and the bad. I went from cable news thinking I'm working in a candle factory right as electricity is getting invented, and the internet is where free speech is going to be happening, this open discourse, and then all of a sudden when I start working in digital media, Mark Levin's show was all online, and we put most of our stuff up on social media. There was a paywall that it was behind as well. And then Daily Caller, all of our revenue came from Facebook and YouTube. I mean, it was really eye-opening, as far as like, we would post a cable news clip of Tucker talking about something like COVID or about the 2020 election, and it would get banned on Facebook,
Right.
right? So I'm thinking to myself, wow, free speech, the cable news is controlled by these massive corporate entities. It's funded by big pharma and all their advertisers. I got to go online to where real free speech is happening. But the profit models there, and the platforms upon which all this discourse is taking place, I mean, you could argue that there's actually they're more censorious than the uh, print and cable news media outlets were. They provided less freedom for people to really say what they were thinking when things got crazy. So I think now, after the wake of 2020 and with the new Trump administration, that's why I think that the book is good timing, because it really shows, like you were saying, families that were split over two people they've never met before. Well, that's why I had to include, the other thing the publishers told me was like, you can't include the memoir with the chronicling. And I just can't separate the personal tragedies that happened in my own life, and the ones that I witnessed up close, as well as the support that I got from my family. And we don't agree politically at all. And my mom, my brothers, like I'm middle of three boys. We There's nothing we agree on politically, but we're family. And like I was stuck in the middle of this stuff, and the politics didn't matter. They knew like what my
That's
lane was.
nice.
And
Right.
my lane was to be on the ground, regardless of whether it's the Proud Boys or the Umbrella Gang, I call them, because most people won't admit to being part of Antifa. If you ask
Right.
their face. Um, but my lane was to just be on the ground and ask questions. And it's like I think that's something that's totally lost on what you were talking about with our digital discourse now is like everybody has this team or that team and they view their role as to either promote or denigrate that their team or the other team. And it's if you're a journalist, if you're a talk show host, that's not necessarily what your lane is. Everybody can't have that lane because then there's nobody standing in the middle asking the questions of like during the Iraq War, during the spring invasion. Who's going to ask those tough questions?
Which Dick Cheney and his friends with Halliburton made a fortune off of, those warmongers. Ugh. You know, last year Tucker Carlson got fired from Fox News, which is probably the best thing that happened to him, because now he's going to make he's making, I'm sure, a ton more money with the
Mhm.
show online. But it was right after, because I used to watch his show religiously, and it was right after he started talking about JFK and the CIA involvement. And also when he started showing some of the January 6th tapes that were hidden from the public, of what was really going on inside and everything. And then all of a sudden, the next day, he was supposed to show it throughout the week. And then I think maybe the heads of Fox News maybe did not want him to do that anymore.
Yeah.
And he stopped showing it so much. What did you have a chance to interact at all with him and with Mark Levin when you were working with them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's the interesting part about my story is like the book basically chronologically, it opens with me starting at the Daily Caller. And I started in May of 2017, which was right when Tucker took over the 8 p.m. primetime slot. And so prior to that, Tucker was not the household name that he became during the Trump years.
Sure.
And it wasn't like this name where you say the name and it's almost, if not more polarizing than bringing up Trump's name. And so, Tucker would come by the office. He divested himself from the Daily Caller when he took over that slot, and but he still, came to the Christmas parties and all that. And I think with Mark Levin and Tucker, the person behind the camera is like, it, I would say, if you compare it to like the cable news hosts that I experienced and encountered with at NBC, there's much less of like a celebrity mentality there of like, I'm the big guy and you're the little guy. They're just as likely to talk to the intern in the newsroom as they are
That's
the
nice.
editor in chief. And I think that that's really like a lot of the reason why Tucker was so successful is because he relies less on like kind of this, you know, this intellectual cadre of this media industrial complex that I was talking about in Washington, D.C. that's so entrenched with the politics and the ideologies of the people that they cover, the politicians that they cover. Tucker's got an intellectual curiosity where he's willing to just say, wait a second, this Nord Stream pipeline thing, like let's just take a look at this. Let's just strip it down to the bare bones, and let's just like take a look at this, who benefits and who doesn't from
Right.
that taking place. And I think once you start looking under the wrong rocks, you can make not only like enemies on, cable news who are saying, oh, Tucker's this and that, but also within the government itself. And I think like um, Tucker certainly stepped on a couple of different traps. And during that time, there was the whole Dominion voting machine stuff that was
Sure.
going on. And like you said, the January 6 tapes, which I've actually gone into those terminals and reviewed the footage to finish out my story with
Oh,
January
neat.
6. So I've followed myself all the way from skateboarding to the Capitol, climbing up the tower, and then following the crowd in as they ran through the doors. But all that to say that, you know, this whole industry that we work in, it's based upon like, you have to have a corporate, in the past, you had to have a corporate backer, you had to have a big cable news platform and a platform to put you out there. But all of that's changed. And you can say what you want about the politics of Mark Levin or Tucker Carlson. I certainly don't have the same politics as they do. But with that being said, I really value the fact that they're kind of grandfathered in to being able to ask these tough questions and ask them in a way that, a lot of people are watching and they can actually move the needle on the conversation that we're having. And what I appreciate most from both of them is asking those tougher questions that are like, oh, don't go there. Oh, no, no, no. Like you could say what you want about the 2020 election, but people should have the right, like they did in 2016,
Sure.
over and over again with this Russian collusion narrative. They should have the right to ask these questions. And the way that you saw that squashed, it's, I think, uh, the best disinfectant is sunlight. And so why can't we talk about that in a free and open discourse?
And a lot of people that don't watch Fox News or didn't watch it when he was on don't realize he called out the right all the time. I mean, people on the right, he would call them out. It wasn't just, the left. Obviously, he's conservative, but he would call out the right all the time. And he would like really abuse some of the congressmen and senators up there that he thought that weren't doing the right thing.
Yeah, I mean, Lindsey Graham being a prime example where, you know, this guy is the embodiment of the Uniparty, of the neocon agenda. And Tucker's not afraid to, say what he really thinks about this. And I think that's a large reason why Trump won as well in 2024, which is he ran on a platform of no new wars. And I'm not a president who's trying to start new ones. And you saw over the course of the Biden administration, I mean, we had two kinetic wars added to the list. You had the pullout of Afghanistan, which was, I mean, by any measure, pretty
Horrible.
disastrous, and that were very disastrous. And I was somebody who waited 20 years for that war to end, and then all of a sudden, the way that it happened, I was like, kind of very saddened by talking to my friends who work within the military and former Marines. They were extremely angry with the fact that we just left all of our stuff over there, and they pulled the military out first, or all these citizens who were caught over there. And I think people really saw the last 4 years and just said, I don't want any more wars, and I just want cheap groceries.
Yeah, exactly right. Even though most people know the name Kyle Rittenhouse, tell us a little bit about him
Mhm.
and your first encounter with him that night when you interviewed him.
So the story of that night, basically Kenosha, because we rewind, why did things happen in Kenosha? There was a man named Jacob Blake who uh, was shot on camera, and this is just the same way that all these other protest zones started. Is you have a cell phone video clip of a police involved shooting slash death. In this case, he actually survived. He lost use of his legs. He was shot 7 times, and the narrative that came out of that video, which if you take the video completely out of context and only have the clip of him being shot, it looks terrible. He's basically trying to enter a vehicle. He gets shot 7 times, four times in the side and three in the back. And the narrative that came out of that was basically that an unarmed black man had been shot in the back 7 times. And you even had the NBA who halted their games. They all wore shirts with 7 shots in the back. And then you take a closer look at what actually happened, and there were kids inside of the car. They were actually his kids. He had prior charges against his the mother of his children, and he had come to that house. She had called 911, and she said, he's dangerous. This guy had a warrant out for his arrest, and according to police, he was armed with a knife, and he was trying to enter and drive a vehicle with 3 kids in it. So, if you look at that broader context, the way that people reacted the moment that they saw the video, I think it tells you everything you need to know about 2020. Is like you had this digital ecosphere where everybody's just seeing that one clip right out of context of something that confirmed their biases, and then boom, it's time to paint the town. Like
Yeah.
let's go to work. And people came from Chicago. They came from the most of the people who were in Kenosha by the second and third night of rioting were not from Kenosha. So I arrived on the second day of rioting. It started on Sunday. I arrived on Monday. That first Monday, we saw the courthouse protected by police. Everybody pushed out, and this was repeated again the second night. But the business that Kyle was standing in front of on that first night of rioting, Kyle was there on the second night. On the first night, Shelby Talcott and I, we saw cars burning in front of that business, and we saw a guy using a pressure washer, and no joke, another guy using buckets of water to put out a fire, a vehicle fire. And we asked the guy, "Hey, why are you out here?" And he just simply stopped the power washer for a second, turned, and just said, "You see the fire department out here?" And so the next night when I saw armed individuals in front of that same business, I knew it was an extension of that same story, which is like there's this power vacuum where, yeah, police were there. Yeah, fire department was there. They were protecting the courthouse and the surrounding municipal buildings, but they were not protecting any of the small businesses in the rest of the city. And so anybody who was a small business owner in the rest of the city, was basically left to their own devices to protect their business. And I'm not justifying um, what happened that night, but if you just watch the course of events from these cars burning in front, the volunteer fire brigade, and then all of a sudden they have the volunteer security team, all armed with rifles. And so when I walked up to that business, there was Kyle standing right in front of it, and I knew I wanted to interview somebody about why they were out there. And I just said, "Hey, does anyone want to talk?" I had my hands in the air. There's like three or four armed guys on the ground, three or four more up on the roof. So it was a situation where I'm walking in just like, "Hey, I'm just a video guy. I'm just trying to ask some questions." And Kyle immediately volunteered himself. And that was 13 minutes before the shooting took place. But my first impression of him was like, wow, like this kid looks young. And this, there's a lot of bad people out here. There's a lot of chaos out here. And I don't think he necessarily realizes what he's getting himself into.
Um, 17 years old, wasn't he when this started?
Yeah, I mean, I told the police the night of he was a baby face, but I thought he was like in his younger 20s just because I couldn't surmise that somebody that young would be out
Sure.
there with a rifle. And but what I definitely did gather from his appearance, from his demeanor, was like that this guy, this what I came to realize actually kid was, very green around the ears, and I think almost had a he was naive to the point of danger because he thought he was out there for all those good reasons, but there were a lot of people who had come from around the area, and they had come for one reason, and that was, like I said, to paint the town and to burn things down. And so when they saw Kyle walking around asking for medical, if anybody needed medical help, they were angered by the fact that he had that rifle. And I guess the rest you can see on video. You can see what happened in the trial. Joseph Rosenbaum, who chased down Kyle Rittenhouse, the first one who was shot and killed,
Right.
that was directly in front of me. I actually had called my coworker. I was walking with Kyle. He was asking if anybody needs medical attention. And then there were like these four guys who yelled at him. They said, "Yo, yeah, you think you're cool, man? We remember you from earlier." And I went to interview those guys because Kyle told me all these reasons that he was out here. All the, I'm out here to defend the businesses. I'm out here to help with the EMT. And these guys didn't think so highly of that mission. So I actually parted ways with Kyle. He walked away. And I said, "Hey guys, you guys want to tell me why you're out here?" I aimed my phone at them. One of the guys had a handgun. Another guy had some bricks in his hand. And I was like, "Okay, sorry, I won't film you. I just want to know why you guys are mad." I put my phone away and I used my classic move of diffusing the situation, which maybe it's not the best thing to do at a riot, but this was my method. I offered them cigarettes and White Claws. I was like, "Does anyone want a White Claw?" And one of the guys was like, "Yeah, actually I do." It was actually the guy with the handgun. And
Right.
so I diffused the situation. And as I was talking with those guys, they were telling me that, Kyle basically, they were near some cars in another lot, and he came up with his rifle and told them not to. I guess a couple of them were setting fire to the cars or smashing the windows. Told them not to do that. And then as I was talking with them, I saw Kyle now running down the street with the AR in one hand and a small fire extinguisher in the other. And so now we have the med pack, we have the fire extinguisher, and we have the AR-15, and he's running. And so I told the guys, "Okay, sorry, I got to go." And I started running down the street after him, and I called my coworker Shelby, and I said, "Where are you? Like, I think crap's about to hit the fan." I don't know if we can swear on this, but
You can.
I did not use, yeah, I did not
Yeah, you
use that
can.
word. And actually, that's right when I heard Joseph Rosenbaum screaming in the direction of Rittenhouse, and I told Shelby, "Oh, F, I gotta go." and I hung up the phone, and I thought that I started recording video with my phone, but actually I took a photo of the ground. So you can see in the video of the shooting, I'm running up behind them, and it wasn't until Kyle turned around and Rosenbaum continued pursuing after him that I realized, like, number one, I could be in the crossfire here, and number two, like, I stopped serving my role as like somebody gathering footage of a what I thought was going to be some kind of news event. I didn't know what was about to happen. To the shots went off. It was four shots in 0.75 seconds, and Rosenbaum collapsed right in front of me. And so that at that point, it was like I put the phone down. I didn't even realize that I hadn't recorded the footage until I was in the hospital, and I said to the police, "I recorded the shooting. Here it is." And I looked at my phone, and my heart dropped
Oh
because I
gosh.
saw that. In that moment, I realized, well, I don't have the footage, and I was the closest one, so I guess I'm gonna have to tell what I saw rather than just delivering the footage to police. And I realized, that I was gonna have to be a witness in this case. And it wasn't until a few weeks before the trial, which happened about a year and a couple months later, that I realized, okay, this is also going to be live. This whole trial is going to be televised, and so that was an experience in and of itself.
Um, can you describe the moment when you realized how dangerous your work was covering Kenosha? Was there an exact moment, when you were nearly shot by him,
Mhm.
Kyle Rittenhouse? Was there a moment that went through your mind like, oh my gosh, I could die right now?
Well, the interesting thing about that, which I talk about in the book, is I told police the night of that I took a step to the side as Rittenhouse was dodging around, and right before he fired, effectively in my mind, taking me off because I was right behind, running behind them. And when Rosenbaum continued after Rittenhouse, I was basically, Kyle had turned around. I was right in the line of fire. So I told the police that I stepped out of the way right before the shots were fired. Now, when I actually saw the footage, especially the drone footage that came out during the trial, DHS was flying a drone over the whole protest. I realized that I didn't take the steps before the shots were fired. I took them after the shots were fired. And my own memory had kind of told myself that those milliseconds that I had taken the steps, to give me agency in that moment. But as those gunshots were going off, I told police that I looked down because I felt something go past my legs. And that was to tell them where my eyes were at the moment of the shooting. Because I said, the shots went off and I looked down and then I looked back over and Rosenbaum was collapsed on the ground. I didn't know this guy's name at the time. I didn't know his criminal history. But what I did know is that I had looked down. And so when I told police that, they actually turned me into a victim in the case as well. So I was a victim of reckless endangerment, even though I didn't ask for it, by Kyle Rittenhouse, as well as a key witness. And so, like, I guess the short answer to your question is yes, but it was too late by the time that I realized. And that that moment when I found out that my actions did nothing to make myself safer, and that actually, my hands were in the life of this 17-year-old with an AR-15 in that moment, that was a very sobering thing for me because it was like you actually had no power in that situation.
Right.
And the following months leading up to the trial, it was really difficult just to serve the role of a witness because I didn't want to, give my personal opinions on the whole situation, given that my role was just to say what I saw from 15 feet away, and putting any color of that with my opinions would, denigrate my role of just, hey, here's what I saw. He screamed F you and he lunged for the gun and he dodged and he shot, and I felt something go past my legs. And that's the long and short of it. So, those objective observations were pitted against both the prosecution and the defense and the left and the right. So getting caught in the middle of that whole thing and then realizing that, I had really no power to change any of the outcome and to keep myself safe, that was really like a huge part of the end of the book, which is like coming to terms with witnessing that tragedy up close. I carried Joseph Rosenbaum to the hospital,
Right.
and I didn't know his criminal history at the time. And so everybody after the fact said, "Oh, he was, he had sexually abused multiple minors, and he had served time for that. But if you look deeper than that, you see that Rosenbaum was sexually abused by his dad, and that the kids that he abused are in jail for the same crimes, and that
Wow.
um, the fact that I didn't realize that at the time, it was just somebody with clearly regretful eyes dying in my arms. I I can't unpack that out of my memory and just say, well, he was this, so it's fine. And that's a big part of, I think, the the purpose of my book and of telling the story from a more personal perspective is like you have these tragedies that take place, and you have the people who were involved in them, and they just become cannon fodder for these political agendas. And especially during that election, obviously, both Biden and Trump went to Kenosha, commented on Kenosha within days of it taking place, and Biden even going so far as to insinuate that Kyle Rittenhouse was a white supremacist, which, if by all measures, I mean, going through the entire trial, that was just simply not the case, and this was framed as a racial uh, shooting, and all the guys that he shot were white. And so I had a lot of people come up to me after the trial and say, wow, I didn't even realize that those guys that he shot were white. Like, I thought they were all black at the black, and that's just because the narrative of
Sure.
white guy shows up with a rifle to a Black Lives Matter, he's a Trump this, he's that. And the fact of the matter is in those situations, things happen like so quickly that there's not even any time to think, oh, like what's the race of this guy who's chasing after me and screaming F you and lunging for my weapon? And that's really what I'm trying to get across in the book is the difference between seeing something happen through the pixels on your phone and experiencing it in real life. And I think that's important for people today, because now every shooting that happens across America, across the world, every terrible thing that happens, everybody can just watch it on their phone
Yep.
immediately. It goes up within minutes. And there's a certain callousness that takes place when you're just, oh, I just saw a guy die on Twitter. Scroll, scroll, scroll. Oh, here's
Sure.
the punched in the head and getting knocked out. Scroll, scroll, scroll. And you forget that those are like actual people, and that there's a humanity that's being lost with the digitization of our discourse.
Absolutely. I say that a lot, that the lack of empathy that people have now in today's world, especially over the last 15 years or so, especially the younger generation too, because they're on it more than probably anybody, even though I see my mom, who's 83, on her phone all the time. But the lack of empathy that people have, you're right, a lot of those videos there is has changed a lot in our society. And you seem like the kind of guy that I am, that even though there's horrible things that Joseph had done in his lifetime, and if you had known ahead of time, you still, like me, you wouldn't have let that guy die. You would have done the same thing and tried to save that guy's life and gotten him to the hospital. You're not just going to sit there and let somebody die just because you knew about that.
Absolutely. And if you look at the other side of the tragedy, Kyle Rittenhouse, also absent father. Um, and the first guy that he shot, the second guy that he shot, Anthony Huber, who was also killed, absent father. And the third guy that he shot, Gage Groskowitz, who survived, who his bicep was shot off. He was actually armed with a gun as well, and he had an absent father. So if you look at the tragedy from that perspective, on both sides, and following all the way through to January 6, 2021, you have people who have broken lives, don't have the job opportunities that they wanted, don't have the family life that they wanted, they don't have a community surrounding them. People, I'm not saying that church is the only answer, but that used to be a community that people surrounded themselves with. The small town America, that used to be another level of community. Local news, local politics, that used to be another level. And all that's gone out the window in favor of this nationalized consciousness of either you're in this political tribe or you're in that political tribe. And that's really where in 2020, all these people took to the streets to find meaning, because they were locked down at home, their businesses were shut down. And, okay, so let's go out on behalf of our political tribe. And so I think that the kind of like the digitization of our hive mind has superseded all of these local newspapers and the local community and the kind of like person to person interactions that we used to have. And so
Absolutely.
I think that really contributes to this idea that everybody is fighting for, our very democracy. And they're even to the point where they're willing to actually like throw their own family out the window, like you
Yep.
mentioned at the very beginning of the show. And that tells you everything you need to know. It's like you, you're favoring your Twitter friends over your own family, because you think that if you don't, if my dad or mom votes for Trump or votes for Kamala Harris, like then, they're not worthy of my time anymore.
And the majority of those people online, they have never met him before and never will meet him.
Mhm. Yeah, you're gonna have to stay tuned. So, Riot Diet, the first book is about all the BLM protests, but I do get into. I did meet Trump in 2015, uh, almost exactly a year before he won. And so in the second book, I get a lot more into the MAGA side of things. After Kenosha, I went to a Proud Boys rally in Portland. I went to the border. I got the Hunter Biden laptop from Rudy Giuliani's apartment. I covered the election in DC, all the stop the steals, and then leading up to January 6th. And I mean, my question on January 6th was just like the moment I showed up, I actually was at home where I had good internet because I knew everybody out on the ground. We had a couple of reporters on the ground, no service whatsoever. There was a huge crowd down there.
Sure.
And then I thought the stuff was going to pop off after dark, like it had with the previous two Stop the Steals, when the counter protesters find everybody leaving the big rally and then they start clashing. But I saw cops running around and I got down there as quickly as I could. I showed up on the Western Front on the police line right as the clashes were starting, and I had bulletproof vest, bulletproof backpack, ballistic helmet, and gas mask on. And my first thought was like, why am I better prepared than almost all these cops? You know, and I mean that's the same thing in Kenosha. Is like these police didn't really stand a chance to uh, maintain law and order with hundreds and thousands of people basically you know in Kenosha it was the courthouse, in DC it was obviously the Capitol.
Right.
But it's also things really change. It's really easy to sit in your armchair and quarterback like, oh, look at these idiot, these MAGA rubes acting like animals, or look at these, violent BLM domestic terrorists. Those were the two kind of like party lines on both sides. It's like when you get pepper sprayed and you see, one of your buddies get billy clubbed, and or the tear gas comes out, like, and the flashbangs. I mean, there's a different part of your brain that gets turned on, and I call it the Lord of the Flies effect. And so it's really easy to sit at home and say like, oh, can't believe they did this or that, but that there is a certain primal aspect of our culture today that we I think we've detached ourselves from. We think we're not that anymore. But
Yeah.
when you get into situations like that, all the thinking goes out the window.
2 years after your experience in Kenosha, you wrote an article for Newsweek magazine to talk about it. It was titled, I was in Kenosha 2 years ago. Kyle Rittenhouse is not a hero. You said, quote, I took off the Black Lives Matter t-shirt I chose that night to blend in with the crowd and use it to staunch the wounds on the first shooting victim, Joseph Rosenbaum. Stumbling across the street carrying Rosenbaum with another man, my hand slipped on slippery sweat and blood, and we nearly dropped him as we loaded him onto the rear of a nearby Dodge Durango. We had to leave the back door or tailgate open to make room for both of us. One of my arms was gripping the back seat headrest so I wouldn't fall out, and the other was cradling his bleeding head and back, unquote. I can't even imagine going through something like that. Uh, you know, Tell us a little bit about what you were talking to him. I know you were talking to him while this was going on, trying to, obviously keep him awake and
Mhm.
encourage him. What was that experience like?
Well, so that's why in the book I had to get into the personal side of things because, I mean, just in our conversation thus far, just as far as like, why was I even at the Daily Caller in the first place? Why were we out there in Kenosha? But then secondarily, with when I experienced this tragedy, this shooting, the first thing that I told my coworker Shelby after it happened was, you know, when I was in the back of the car with Rosenbaum, I knew that he was dying. You could hear that his one of his lungs was collapsed, and it was clear that he had a lot of regret in his eyes, and that wherever he was going, he didn't want to go. And I immediately told Shelby, I saw my dad's blue eyes, and my dad had passed away in 2017, right when I started working at the Caller, actually within a month. And I experienced those two tragedies almost like they merged on that night, because when my dad died, the whole family was there. My brothers and I, we were surrounding the bed. My mom was there. He saw the nurse leave the room. He decided that it was his moment to leave. And we were all surrounding him, and he went to one place. And when I saw Joseph Rosenbaum die, I saw him go to a different place, a much different place. And I saw a lot of regret, and somebody who was looking back on their life with sadness, and, basically comparing those two experiences. I think it's important for the reader to know not only like what my personal experience was with it, but also like what happens at the end of someone's life. What are you going to look back on? What are you going to regret? And I think that everybody kind of has like this like 5-second attention span now,
Yes.
where it's so easy to fly off the handle and get angry. But ultimately, if you look at this in longer terms, my dad used to always joke before he passed away, like, oh, like your generation is so screwed. Like we had it so good, and I'm dying at the right time. And I think, my dad's he was an ER doctor as well. So, my instinct to try to help Rosenbaum wasn't based on any thinking process. It was just what I had seen my dad do over the course of my childhood. And I think all that really just like ties into, if you look on the longer trajectory of the Trump era, of what that means, of the Obama era, of what that means. And me at 35 years old, I'm thinking more, you know, what is it? How can we pick up the pieces from this and build something separate and new, rather than still relying on, the old institutions, the old way of having conversations. And that's why I started a publishing company to write the book, because I wasn't prepared to play these, all the big publishers told me I had to pick a side if I wanted to sell books.
Mm-mm,
It's not the point of the story. I mean,
not at all.
the reader can take from it what they will, and I don't shy away from my opinion or my political inclinations in the book. But with that being said, like that didn't change my role, right? My lane was to be on the ground, to say what up. Why are you out here? Whether it's the Umbrella Gang, or MAGA dudes, or Proud Boys, or whatever it is.
Absolutely. Um, I never thought about this whole thing about when that happened being upon party lines. Unfortunately, it turned out being that way. Um, I remember seeing your interview on Fox News with I believe you went on the Tucker Carlson show,
Yeah.
and to talk about your experience that night. And then a CNN reporter said you, quote, supported the conservative claim Rittenhouse acted in self-defense, unquote. And, the truth is, like I talked about, Tucker used to have people on his show from both sides of the aisle, and would give them a chance, and even though you were working for a conservative website when this happened, a lot of people didn't know that you had also, it's like you talked about, you worked at NBC, before that too. But when you were doing this book, just like you've mentioned, this wasn't anything to do with politics or who believes what. It was about what happened, right?
Exactly. And that's the point where, especially with all the protests that happened over the summer, and then everything that happened leading into the Stop the Steals and January 6th, it was like everybody saw the reality that they wanted to see from that. And the simple, like a fact as simple as, did the guy, did Rosenbaum lunge for Rittenhouse's gun? I mean, it was so plain as day. And I was 15 feet away, and the video that, because my phone wasn't recording, that you can see, I mean, it's still pretty clear. He's chasing him down, and he screams. You can hear him say "F you" right before the shooting takes place. And so I was like maligned, by one side for stating what I saw in that Rosenbaum lunge for the gun. I mean, such a simple fact. Like literally his hands grasping for the front of the gun, diving for it. It was as obvious as it comes. And then the other side, and the op-ed that you quoted as well. I mean, I got a lot of look. I knew I was stepping on the hornet's nest when I wrote that article, so
Sure.
I'm not complaining by any stretch. But just the fact that I was also a victim because I told the police that I looked down, and so the right and the defense didn't really like the fact that they said, "Were you afraid for your life at the moment that you looked down?" And I said yes because that was the truth as well. And these simple, when you have something happen, whether it's an election, whether it's a shooting, whether it's a protest, you should go straight to the primary sources. And you can vet those primary sources as you will, and that's fine. And I faced plenty of scrutiny, and I expected that. With all that being said, you're not your opinion on the matter, you can't have a predetermined opinion on it. And if you do, and if you just have a knee jerk to everything that happens has got to go either this way or that way, then that's when we get into real trouble because we start living in two completely separate realities. And you see the way that CNN, I mean, I had to fight to correct the record, and that whole story is in the book
Right.
to get onto CNN and correct the record. I give actually Drew Griffin, uh, who did the report, the original report, was the one who had me back on, and I think that says everything, which is it's about human to human relationships. And like it's really easy to sit in your studio and just like have that knee jerk reaction and be like, these people are this, these people are that. But the moment that, that person comes up to you and says, "Hey, why'd you say that?" Like this is actually what it was, and I was there and you weren't. And then that it creates a whole new bridge that otherwise wouldn't exist if I had to just actually it was my boss. Thank you to my boss, Jeff Ingersoll, who talked me off the ledge. I was like, CNN said this, and I'm gonna go on Twitter and that's a lie. And you know, he was like, calm down. We have channels. There's a PR guy. Let's email him. And so I went through those proper channels. But the fact of the matter is we're not asking ourselves the right questions when these things happen. Is like, who was there? And like, why did they go there? And well, let me try to understand that better rather than let me try to find all the information that confirms my own bias so that I can dunk on the other side.
Exactly. How can people find you or follow you on social media? And also, how can they get the new book?
So it's Richie McGinniss, which RICHIEMCGINNISS. Two I's, two N's, two S's there for a nice Irish name. But I don't know who spelled that. If it was Ellis Island or one of my ancestors who had some
Right.
whiskey. But it's the same for everything. So Twitter, Instagram, and if you search Riot Diet on Amazon, it'll come right up. You can also go to pigeonpress.com. That's the new publishing company that I started. Not a peacock, not a penguin, both useless, flightless birds. The pigeon used to be a nice, humble messenger. And so that's why I started that publishing company. And so, yeah, Richie McGinniss, Pigeon Press. And I appreciate you having me on.
Well, there's a lot more I want to talk to you about. So definitely, we've already scheduled for you to come back on for part two in a couple of weeks. And honestly, Richie, as many questions as I have, we might have to do a part three because there's
I'm
just
down.
so much. There's just so much I want to talk to you about that we haven't even gotten into today. So I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. I know you have some exciting things that we'll talk about next time you come on that are happening for you over the next few weeks. So it's really great for you. Is the book available right now for purchase or is it pre-purchase?
Yeah, so it's available for purchase. You can get the Kindle and the ebook are both full color. So sorry, the ebook and the paperback color. Those are on one page. Basically, Amazon doesn't let you link two paperbacks. Then there's a black and white paperback that's cheaper.
Okay.
And so I do recommend. I actually make slightly less money on the color copy, but I got the price as low as I could because I really think that it's much better. There's 140 over 140 photos in there. There's illustrations, and so seeing it in full color, really like, seeing the fireworks and the flashbangs and all that. I think it does really give the reader a much better idea of what it was like out there. And that was my goal from the beginning was like just write this book so somebody can read it 20 years from now. And and get a feeling for what it was like to be standing in those shoes.
And you also have there's still videos all over YouTube, isn't there?
Yeah, and I'm working on now. I'm working on the audiobook as well as putting together a package of videos that basically will allow the reader to follow along with the video. So there's a lot of images in there right now, but eventually I will have some playlists up. Richie McGinniss is my YouTube as well, which I am going to build out as I start to populate those
Yeah,
videos.
tens of millions of views on some of those videos.
Yeah, I mean it's crazy. Actually, the last thing I'll say, just as a teaser, is on January 6th, which I've already finished the second book. It's just going through the editing process right now.
Right.
But my most viral video on January 6th was not going to the house doors, was not the crowd outside of those doors. It was a guy when the police finally pried everyone off those doors, came back to the rotunda. It was a guy who decided to roll and smoke a doobie inside of the Capitol rotunda. So that just tells you everything you need to know about like the roller coaster ride of surreal experiences in 2020 and 21.
Well, this has been awesome, man. I appreciate you coming on today and talking about your experiences. And I look forward to having you back on in a couple of weeks.
But thanks for having me.
All right. My pleasure. Thank you.